Okay, everyone, welcome back to our next session here at the workshop Military as a Legal and Constitutional Actor, Socio-Legal Perspective and Approaches, which is hosted here at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and generously supported by an LSA Advanced grant. So we really acknowledge that support. Over the past 3 days, we had really interesting discussions on the various socio-legal research projects that you have had in different countries across the regions, from Indonesia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Philippines, Nepal. So really interesting insights. And today, on this day, we have moved towards discussing more broadly, how are we conducting such research? In our panel, we have the opportunity to think about the possibilities and challenges of undertaking research in and on illiberal, authoritarian, or military contexts, and are particularly interested in how such research can then be presented in a book. And we are fortunate enough that our host, Professor Melissa Crouch here at UNSW Law, has recently published a really interesting book, the Palimpsest Constitution, The Social Life of Constitutions in Myanmar. Sounds already really interesting, came out in Oxford University Press end of last year. And this is an opportunity to hear from Melissa how she has gone about this book. We have then 2 discussants on our panel, both here also at UNSW. There's Shohini Sengupta, who is an Associate Professor of Law at Jindal University and a PhD candidate and teaching fellow here at UNSW. And prior to Jindal, she worked in the field of legislative policy making and is particularly interested in the intersection of finance and technology law. Shohini, thanks so much for joining us as a discussion here. Second, we have Suhail Rashid Bhat, who is a lawyer, teaching fellow and PhD candidate, also here at UNSW. So great cohort of PhD students at UNSW. And his doctoral research examines the role of people's tribunals in shaping popular non-state understandings of international law and accountability, but also has a long-standing career as a legal practitioner in India prior to that. So thank you both for joining and engaging this discussion. But without further ado, I hand over to Melissa to tell us more about this exciting book.
Thank you, Christoph, and thank you to all of you who are here. I'm very much looking forward to the opportunity to discuss the book from the perspective of methods, or what I'm going to suggest today is a more than methods approach, which I'll explain in a moment. But just in brief, in terms of what the book is about, so the book begins with the assassination of a Burmese lawyer, U Ko Ni, who I knew and had interviewed a number of times, who had called for the amendment to the 2008 Constitution to remove the privileges of the military. So his advocacy was so radical, his advocacy for constitutional reform, that his assassination was widely attributed to the military. And it is actions like his and efforts by legal advocates and others to draft alternative constitutions that were perceived as radical acts of resistance, very much opposed by the military. And so while I begin in the past, I then look back, while I begin in the present, I look back to the past and trace some of the constitutional legacies throughout Myanmar's history, from when it was Burma and under British rule to the post-colonial and then socialist and various military eras. And so, as I mentioned, Kony was rumoured to be subversively drafting an alternative constitution, which was something the military was not happy with. And so I include sort of his story in as part of the book as a way to suggest that these counter-constitutional texts or non-state constitutions are equally worthy for us to investigate and analyse and pay attention to, and that perhaps, in fact, they are central to constitutional legacies rather than being marginal. So in Myanmar, we see that anti-military, pro-democratic and federal groups have a long and proud history of non-state constitution making, from the early texts of Burmese nationalists fighting under colonial rule to federal aspirations of minority groups from the 60s onwards, to constitutional texts that were committed to both democracy and federalism, or in short, simply civilian rule, from the 1990s and 2000s onwards. And the most recent expression of that today is the 2021 Federal Democracy Charter, which is a text that the National Unity Government and its supporters have put together as a way of both rejecting the military's 2008 constitution and proposing an alternative constitutional future through these constitutional texts. And so part of my broader point in the book is to suggest that these non-state constitutions tell us a lot about society as much as they do about law. That is, that society in Myanmar is very much both fiercely resistant to military rule and committed to working towards a civilian future. And this is something I think that broadly in studies of law we tend to overlook, and that this commitment to civilian rule is actually something that is perhaps under threat worldwide, and something we need to pay more attention to. So in short, that's the sort of substance of the book, but let me turn to the book in terms of sociolegal studies and this idea of perhaps a more than methods approach. And the book is an attempt to try and bring law and society perspectives to the study of constitutions and to this global phenomenon of constitution making. Now, of course, I don't know about you, but certainly in my law school and elsewhere in Australia, there have been growing discussions about methods in legal research. And while these are very welcome, I think sometimes it tends towards being quite instrumental, as if methods is some sort of tool or hammer that you pick up, but without thought given then to, in particular, the writing process that flows from that. So let me talk sort of broadly about this more than methods approach in three ways. So today I'll briefly talk something about the idea that all knowledge is situated and how that should inform our research. And by that I mean that all knowledge, and that includes knowledge of law, has a time and a place and a context. And I think we should be sort of foregrounding that time and place and context rather than either implicitly assuming certain empirical settings or marginalizing research that is explicit about the context that it's talking about. So the second is I'll talk a bit about sort of constitutions in societies or constitutional ethnography approach. And then I'll talk about how our methods and orientation informs our writing. So how do we write? And the way I think of it as writing ethnographically. So on this first point of knowledge being situated. So the book begins with an assassination, which I admit may seem strange, extraordinary, or perhaps distant, or perhaps not. But what I want to suggest is that the approach that I take can be used across a range of research projects and does not require an extraordinary event of this kind, although it can be used in that way. So this lawyer who I knew and whose family I'd met and whose children I'd met was tragically assassinated, and I wondered what to do with this fact. Do I include it as part of a story about constitutions and constitutional history, or should I, in a more objective way, leave it aside and separate it out? So I turned to an anthropologist, Renato Rosaldo's work, particularly a piece on called Grief and a Headhunter's Rage, which I think helped me to think through why I should include this experience. And I want to sort of foreground the point that I come to, and then I'll tell you his story, although perhaps some of you have read the piece. So in short, in my words, what I think he is saying in that piece and from his fieldwork is to affirm that lived experience is a form of knowledge, that lived experience matters to intellectual inquiry, that lived experience can transform what you know and how you know it. Lived experience has a place in academic scholarship. It's not merely subjective knowledge, nor can objective knowledge be divorced cleanly from subjective knowledge. So to put it another way, I think a lot of legal scholarship, particularly Anglo-American legal scholarship, whether that's constitutional law or law and society, often assumes a certain set of lived experiences that are implicit, although occasionally are made explicit. So let me come to Renato's experience, which he explains in Grief and Headhunter's Rage. In short, in the 1960s and early 1970s, Renato and his wife, as anthropologists, conducted research among the Ilongots, a headhunting community in the Philippines. He was focused on trying to understand this practice of headhunting after the death of a community member. And he was trying to grasp the meaning inherent in this practice. But as he explains, he confronted barriers when he asked his participants directly. And perhaps many of you can relate to experiences where you've had interviews and come away feeling like you didn't actually learn much or get much out of that interview experience. And so he says when he asked his interlocutors about this practice, they simply said, well, our rage in bereavement compels us to headhunt. And he couldn't get any further insights. But then the 1970s, as Marcos rose to power, the state banned headhunting and ended the practice. And then a decade later, the Rosaldos returned to field research. So him and his wife were there. But one day his wife went out walking with two locals. They were up high on a cliff and she stumbled and fell down the cliff into the river. And they were unable to retrieve her body. The two locals returned back to the village to tell Renato that his wife was gone. And so several years after this abrupt and unexpected loss, he reflects on this experience in his piece, Grief and Headhunter's Rage. And he suggests that his understanding of Headhunter's grief came only through his own painful experience after he himself had been repositioned through a devastating loss. And so his position was no longer as a detached ethnographer, but rather as a widower who had been changed by his new perspective on life and death. And so he tells how he gained this new appreciation about the way in which the Ilongots channeled their grief at rage and death, previously exhausted by headhunting, into new forms of lament. And I think sometimes, like Renato, despite our best attempts to understand through observation, the meaning of other people's experiences often eludes us. But also, like Renato, we often gain new understanding as we are repositioned by our experiences in the field or in life. And so what Renato demonstrates, I suggest, is that we retain the ability to choose how to respond to tragedy and whether and how to give it a place in our research as a source of insights. And I've wondered often about his decision to return to the village many years later, but also to write explicitly about this experience, although, of course, he did so many years after her death and not immediately. And so I think in doing so, Renato, I don't think he's opposed to the idea or the possibilities of universal or shared experiences, but rather on the contrary, identifies the ways that shared human experiences are expressed in different ways in different cultures. So bringing this to Myanmar then and to the book, it felt to me that the assassination of the lawyer I knew couldn't be excluded in any way from this particular story about constitutional history and the contemporary period in Myanmar. And so I included it in the book as a way of trying to stay engaged with that tragedy and what it told us about constitutional legacies in a place like Myanmar in particular. And to me, it highlighted the risks, the very real risks that many people take in advocating for constitutional reform and particularly for civilian rule or democratic rule in places where that is not welcome and hostile. and the sort of broader sense of the relationship between constitutions and violence. Now, I'll turn to the second part of my presentation, but just a caveat by way of this idea of knowledge as situated. One, I would sort of reject some of the perhaps relativizing claims and suggest that we can still compare, that it doesn't mean that, you know, everyone's experience is unique, but rather that it's a call to be more explicit about the times and places that we study, or at least the way that our knowledge is shaped by those times and places. Does everyone have to write about or include their own experiences, whether that's experiences through fieldwork or experiences through life? No, I don't think so. I think, you know, there's a time and a place for these things, and I'm sort of comforted by the fact that it took Renato almost 10 years to write about the death of his own wife in relation to his academic scholarship. But I think it's important to have the possibilities to create that space in academia for these perspectives. So let me come then briefly to the second part, which is this idea of constitutions in societies, or the way in which constitutions in societies approach can help us incorporate experiences like this and incorporate knowledge as situated. Now, for those of you who are familiar with law and society scholarship, you'll immediately understand that I'm sort of building on a long history of scholarship here that has shifted effectively from law and scholarship, which sort of saw law and society as two distinct things, but bringing them together, to what some scholars called law in society, so sort of recognizing the closer relationship between law and society, to a much more plural laws in societies approach, recognizing both the plurality of law beyond the nation state, as well as the pluralism inherent in society. And so hence a constitutions in societies approach. So what is this orientation, or sort of more than method approach? One, I suggest that constitutional pluralism is central to it, and law and society scholars have long had an interest in legal pluralism, although this is of course uncommon for doctrinal or constitutional scholarship. In the book, I try to sort of foreground both the multiplicity of constitutional texts that a country like Myanmar has had, the numerous alternative constitutional texts, which doctrinal scholarship might say are failures, but which in fact I think live on in people's social memories and are still very much part of the kind of activism and advocacy for reform in Myanmar. And in particular, these sort of non-state processes that, despite the fact that they are not recognised in a formal way, are very much part of resistance movements against authoritarianism and military rule. So the second characteristic then is this idea of the constitutive impulse. And again, for those of you familiar with law and society scholarship, this idea of the relationship between law and society being constitutive is a very common one. And yet I suggest, particularly when it comes to constitutional law, we often don't think in that way, or at the very least, discussions around constitutional design in particular have a fairly linear perspective on that relationship. So that is, we design a constitution in a certain way in the hopes of engineering certain social outcomes. And that is the direction sort of that the relationship is understood to flow. And so I think law and society scholarship can disrupt that thinking about the relationship and recognise the back and forth that happens in terms of the influences of society on law as well as law on society. The third then aspect of this orientation is interdisciplinarity, but in particular an interpretive approach. And in the social sciences in the 1970s and onwards, we've sort of seen very much a rise in the idea of social sciences as a science, which is attendant with ideas of rationalism, particularly law and economics, rational choice analysis, quantitative analysis, and so on. And so this was sort of the idea that the social sciences should be like a natural science, and that we can use ideas from the natural sciences, whether that's causation or generalization or objectivity, in social science research. And of course, against this, there were scholars in the social sciences who instead suggested an interpretive approach and very much rejected the idea that the social sciences should be like the natural sciences or had to talk or operate in that framework. And this more interpretive approach is one that recognises that people's actions and lives are very much motivated by certain meanings and by the culture that they are in, and that this can only really be understood through interpretation. So finally, then, so in addition to this idea of constitutional pluralism, the constitutive impulse, and interpretivism, I've suggested that ethnography is one particular method that I think is useful in getting at lived experience and the knowledge that can be found there. Interestingly, I think ethnography, although it originates in anthropology, is now used across many disciplines, and I think there's a lot of uses that we can bring it to bear on legal scholarship. So let me come just to the last part of what I want to say, which is about writing ethnographically. And this is also where I want to kind of emphasize this idea of a more than methods approach. So to me, the way that we write is an extension of the methods and the orientation that we have in our research. It's not really possible, I don't think, to do ethnography and not to write ethnographically. Now, that's not to say there's variation. There's no variation in ethnography. There certainly is, variation and differences of approaches to writing in ethnographic research, and there are many debates, of course, that go along with that. But the sort of more basic point I want to make is that particularly in fields that study constitutionalism and comparative constitutional law, I think one of the unusual aspects of this current turn to methods is that there's not yet any discussion about how we write or why we write and the way that we write. And I think you only need to look to disciplines like anthropology, history, or sociology to see that there are very clearly different kinds of writing conventions in different fields. And I think we can bring these too to the study of law. And so if we're writing ethnographically, what might this look like? Or how did I try to do this in the book? So let me just briefly touch on 3 areas and then I'll finish up. The first that I was conscious of is audience. So, often when I attend conferences about constitutional law, the people who are speaking are trying to convince judges and lawyers of certain legal arguments or ideas, or particular ways of interpreting a constitution, or advancing a particular trajectory of liberal democracy. And it always struck me that that wasn't my goal. And that's still an admirable goal, but I think there are other audiences that can be targeted. And so on one hand, I'm not trying to convince judges of anything, but in many ways simply present the case of Myanmar as a possible comparative example of certain kinds of experiences that I think are not actually unusual, but are quite common in many parts of the world and yet are underrepresented in scholarship, particularly in scholarship on constitutionalism in the Global South. So the second is the question of representation and in writing, and this is one that I think often has no easy answers. How do I write as a foreigner about a country that I am not from? How do I write about the experiences of people who I only know through fieldwork, and whose stakes, if you like, and whose reality are not my own? But also, how do I write when the situation is changing so rapidly? So I began this project before 2021, so before the military coup in Myanmar. And then, of course, when the military coup happened, everything changed. And so I was aware that even if people had given me permission to mention their names, that I had to rethink, in some sense, every single person as to whether it was appropriate or not. name them. Some of the choices I made were things like if people were deceased, then generally speaking, I would mention them. If they were high-profile public figures in the military, I mentioned them by name. But particularly where they were on the pro-democratic side or lawyers who in various ways are resisting the military, I often either chose not to name them or sometimes I simply didn't include their experiences in the book because I didn't want there to be any way for them to be put at risk. But these, as I say, there are many choices here. Whether I made the right ones or not is something I still think about. And I think it's a reminder that ethics, as Liz mentioned this morning, is very much an ongoing process, particularly for those of us who work in contexts where the situation is changing so rapidly, from the time of when we so-called gain consent from participants to the time when we are writing it up. So then finally, the last point I wanted just to note is on narrative. So I have written many journal articles to which I have received the response, this is just a story, can you please, enhance your argument and reduce the narrative? And in part, that experience simply convinced me that maybe I was submitting to the wrong journals. But also it has made me more insistent on the use of narrative and stories in academic scholarship, because I think it can be an approach and a method and a way of theoretical engagement that draws the reader into a particular context and invites them to see the world differently by rethinking what they know. And so I sort of reject this idea that narrative is a mere anecdote, but rather I think it's very much a way of representing and illustrating the webs of meaning, as some scholars have put it, about the way in which humans act. In addition, I use the sort of first person and write myself into the narrative, in part because it was a way that I could obfuscate some of the identities of the people who I had met in the field and whom I didn't want to put at risk in any way. So that's all that I want to say, but I just hope that there might be something in there that sparks discussion and conversation about methods and more than methods in legal scholarship. But I look forward to hearing from our other panel members about what they think. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. There's definitely a lot in there, and I think it's too rare that we have these kind of reflections, not just of how we do our research, but also how we think about our own research. That was really great. I hand now over to our discussants. Maybe start with Shohini and then go to Suhail.
I'm quite loud. I'm constantly told to be quiet. So if this is too loud, just let me know. Thank you, Melissa and Christoph as well. This was a very resonant, we are going to talk about the book, but I should say this was very resonant with a lot of frustrations we feel, with a lot of what we experience in the world today. So thank you for that. I really enjoyed the book for many reasons. So I'll go through that and then perhaps I'll pose a few questions or moments of reflection for you to come back on. So one, I think the book helps us understand not just constitutionalism, but world making and world making through law, but also through memory and politics, scripts, actors, archives, both living and non-living, and in seeing constitutionalism as neither science nor politics, but a reinscription of memory, of history, of achieving and enduring palimpsest constitutions, you cleave the field open to seeing law and legal legacies in unlikely places. I've also been thinking about the legacies of partitions, all 5 of them in the Indian subcontinent, that ties what we see as really disparate regions today, from Myanmar or Burma, as it used to be called, all the way to the Gulf states of Oman, the UAE, and Yemen. So the process of political decolonization and modern constitution making cannot be separated from these older connections of lands and peoples and histories. What I loved about your book is the way in which you direct our gaze to these older histories and legacies of colonialism in this region, and how then these older constitutional and legal legacies are used as an oppositional force to prop up newer regimes of law or constitutions. So even though this book is about Myanmar, I found it really generative to think with others on these shared histories of violence and tragedy, and to think more productively about the law now. So as you mentioned in your talk right now, so these situated knowledges can also help transcend boundaries, territorial, epistemological, while also help us see solidarities through critical orientations. So what Melissa mentioned as more than a method. So from situated knowledges to possibilities of rage, of resistance, creations and negations, especially in the way we see the third world now as a form of theoretical resistance. So on that, I wanted to hear more from you on why you chose to document your experiences in the form of an academic book. So why do you think academic books matter, but particularly in the context of the third world or the post-colony? Do you see academic books as forms of intellectual decolonization, in quotes, particularly in the neoliberal global Western university, such as the one that we occupy now, or as a form of deconstruction to disrupt the hegemony of the West, introducing legal knowledge, particularly in the fields of public law and constitutionalism? Um, on law and society and scholarship in general, much of which you spoke about just now, in the book you demonstrate how military rule is often a legal project and not just a political one, showing how law is not separate from society or adjacent to it, but as co-constitutive of society. Um, in this, I loved how you demonstrated that the military itself is a constitutional actor. But I also saw this as liberating constitutions, and liberating law in general from reform projects, from being limited to the civil state. So, would you be able to speak more to the mess, the chaos, and the contingency, as you mentioned in the book, of the social life of constitutions, but of law in general? And how did you, as a researcher, but also as a friend who has lost other friends in your experience, an ally, also feature in this mess and contingency? And lastly, we know from your book that modern constitutions are palimpsests because they draw on previous constitutional principles, scripts, and politics. Um, and the fact that constitutional making can never be separated from the act of producing the nation state itself. I wondered, though, if what you say of constitutions is also applicable to law in general and applicable also to non-military states, perhaps Western liberal states as well. So I see this book being read in non-military liberal democratic contexts as well, even though it's situated in Myanmar, not as a case study, but as I said, as a place of theory creation. So how would you like to see the book travel to non-military contexts, or even military contexts like Australia?
Thank you, Shohini, for that brilliant reflection. I wish this book was written before I started my PhD and was titled Palimpsest International Law, so that I would have picked it up and not struggled in getting answers to the questions of how do you write about people or countries that you do not belong to? And more importantly, how do you write about when things change at the drop of the, just like that. So that's something that I have been struggling for many years, and I think all of us have been. But coming to your book, Melissa, and I should perhaps begin with a confession, a small confession, which I believe is no longer a small confession. It was already introduced that I am a lawyer by training, so not necessarily an academic who writes long essays, books, but nonetheless, I am in this space. My instincts when approaching the questions of law is often to ask fairly conventional questions. What does the law say? How do the institutions work? What arguments are available within the existing legal framework? So when you pick up Melissa's book on constitution, you would be almost forgiven to expect that, and which I did as well, perhaps naively, that's a book about constitution. But don't get me wrong, it is, of course, it is a book about constitution. What I mean is that the book constantly escapes the boundaries of what constitutional lawyers normally think a constitutional law book should do. We encounter archives, classrooms, museums, political movements, constitutional controversies, personal histories, and sites of memory. There are even photographs in the book, and that too in a constitutional law book. That resonated strongly with me because the central question animating my own research on People's Tribunal is not entirely different. I am interested in how legal meaning is produced outside of formal institutions and how communities engage in what I call jurisprudence from margins. That is how legal knowledge is generated in spaces that lack formal authority, but nevertheless participate in legal arguments, interpretation, and imagination. Reading this book, I should say, a few chapters, I found myself asking a similar question. If constitutional meaning is not produced exclusively in courts, legislatures, and constitutional texts, then where does it come from? Melissa answers, I think, in one of the most interesting parts of the book. Constitutional meaning emerges through archives, commemorations, museums, classrooms, workshops, political history, political movements, and everyday constitutional conversations. Constitutional life is not confined to institutions, it's circulated through society. Constitutions survive Constitutions survive not simply because the text endures, but because people continue to remember them, invoke them, contest them, and more importantly, reimagine them. In a way, it's an attempt at the constitutionalism from below, an attempt to own, interpret, and develop constitutional law. For me, this is perhaps the book's most significant contribution. It shifts our attention away from constitutions as document and towards constitutions as lived social practices. And that shift has an important implications for how we think comparatively. Many of us work in places marked by conflict, militarization, colonial inheritance, or authoritarian rule. What the book offers is not a framework for collapsing these experiences into a single narrative. Rather, it gives us a language for thinking how constitutional legacies continue to shape political life across very different settings. Finally, I wanted to say a brief word about the appendix because I think it's doing something much more significant than simply explaining methods, which Melissa, I think, highlighted very beautifully here in your talk. Melissa reminds us that the research is not merely a technical exercise, it's an ethical practice. Questions of risk, responsibility, care, access, and positionality are not external to knowledge production. They shape what can be known and what can be written. As someone who often still feels more comfortable calling himself a lawyer than an academic, I found that this book both refreshing and reassuring. So perhaps the central insight I take from this book is that constitutions are simply not texts that govern society. They are social worlds that people continuously inhabit, contest, remember, and remake. And that, I think, is what makes this such an important contribution, not only to the constitutional law scholarship, but to broader sociolegal studies broadly. I wanted to end with two brief questions, which I have slightly changed from the ones that I earlier thought. One of the striking feature of the book is the way constitutional meaning emerges through people and social practices rather than formal institutions alone. What does constitutional ethnography allow us to see about constitutional life that more state-centered approaches might systematically miss? And the second one is about the use of pictures. One thing that struck with me was the prominence of constitutional actors throughout the book, including the photographs, and these honor the conventional constitutional actors and the biographical narratives. I wonder whether that was a conscious methodological choice. Did writing ethnographically about constitutional law change how you thought about who or what should become visible in the story of constitutionalism? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, first of all, for taking the time for such a close read, but also sharing these reflections with us. Don't be surprised if she asks you afterwards for a book review. I give the word to Melissa for some responses. In the interest of time, maybe just pick what you would like to respond to.
Thank you. Thank you to you both. That was very generous and a lot to think through. The last question is one that intrigues me, so let me start with that, but I'll come back to yours, Shohini. So a story that I haven't yet been able to tell is, so the book has two characters, actually. U Kong Ni is the lawyer who was assassinated and who was on the side of the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. I wanted a counterpoint because I knew that the military, they have their own lawyers. They think law is important, and I wanted a character that embodied that. And in the history of Myanmar, the person that people usually talk about, and scholars like Nick Cheeseman have written about, is Dr. Maung Maung, who sort of comes through in the 1940s, but then becomes very prominent in the 60s and 70s, and is very much the lawyer who works in the service of the socialist/military regime, and is responsible for the destruction of the courts. And Nick tells that story very well. But I wanted someone who sort of brought us into the present, and I was fortunate that there is a lawyer whose name is Tin Aung A. He's still alive. He effectively was a military bureaucrat. He was never a military officer himself, but he worked in the service of the military regime. He became a professor and then a rector at various universities, wrote all the legal textbooks. He then became a Supreme Court judge. And then in the reform era, as many of these military bureaucrats did, he became a judge of the Constitutional Tribunal. So sort of reformed, if you like. And now the story, so coming to the pictures, the story is that I tried to interview him, but he refused. And so on one hand, you could say that's a failure in field research. What do you do when the person you need to interview refuses to let you interview them? I'd met his grandson and I'd met one of his sons, and I was working really hard to try and get that interview, but it just turned out the timing was wrong. Post 2012, all 9 members of the Constitutional Tribunal resigned in a very political case. And so he wasn't talking to journalists, and he sort of saw me as, someone who was outside and who he didn't want to talk to. So that was closed to me. But I had his books, and anyway, there was enough in there and enough written about him, and he had written so much that I was able to kind of include him as the counterpoint to U Kong Ni. Anyway, going to the picture. So the problem I had was, of course, I had many pictures of U Kong Ni, and so that was fine. We were able to get one. I didn't have a picture of Tin Aung A because I'd never met him, but there were pictures in books he'd published. And so I contacted his grandson and said, look, I'm writing this book. Your grandfather features in it. Do you think you could contact him so I can get permission to publish his photo? And now I was like, I'm sure he's going to ask me what's the book about, or can I see a copy first? Anyway, it took a little while for him to get back to me, and he's like, yeah, my grandfather said it's fine. And I was like, are you sure? You haven't read the book, you don't know what it's. But anyway, so I have the picture of Tin Aung A because he kindly gave me permission, even though he hasn't actually read a copy of the book, and declined for me to interview him. Anyway, so let me come back then to books, Shohini, the importance of academic books. On one hand, given the discussion over the last 2 days, I'm almost reluctant, to suggest that you should be focusing on academic books, in the sense that for contexts like Myanmar, as well as places like Indonesia and elsewhere, there are many more important and urgent things that perhaps we could be working on. There are scholars working to support activists in court cases as expert witnesses, policy reform, media engagement, podcasts. Many of these things I think are really important, and also kind of count in knowledge production in the present. But I hope that academic book is still relevant, or perhaps more relevant in the age of AI, in the sense that it stands as a marker for what has happened in Myanmar, and maybe sort of for a future generation of students there who can look back on that history, or perhaps relearn the history, which in many ways is kind of in ruins across the country. So your second question, Shohini, I think was around liberating constitutions, and the mess of research and scholarship. And it's certainly something that I try to capture in this book. I think what I was writing against in that sense is, there are many books in legal scholarship, but particularly constitutional scholarship, that are very focused on providing the solution, and the research is all driven towards coming to that quite neat solution to the problem that we face. And on one hand, I'm very sympathetic, particularly to my Burmese colleagues. Some of them actually said to me, Melissa, why didn't you write a book on federalism and how federalism could save Myanmar? And I sympathize with them because I appreciate that desperation for a future constitutional design that may help to resolve some of these issues. But it just wasn't the book that I could write. Maybe somebody else can. And just finally, so this question of could the book be applicable beyond some of its parameters, whether that's military, Myanmar more broadly? I certainly hope so. And, I very much welcome people to run with it if that possibility is there. By way of sort of some minor comments I've had from others, a friend from the US said, oh, this is just describing what J.D. Vance has done in his recent speech in a revisionist history of the American Constitution. He's just totally rewritten it in that Orwellian sense of, the palimpsest, the way that you describe it. Maybe another friend from China said, oh, this is sort of how we teach constitutional scholarship in China, as in we take students through each of the constitutions and explain how it's relevant to our history. And there's this sense that, there is more than one constitutional text, and we have to have that understanding of more than one constitutional text in order to understand the present. Maybe there is, but I'm happy to leave it to others to explore those possibilities and take the ideas further. I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for these great discussions. Time for a little applause here. I really enjoyed those discussions. This ends our recorded part, and we can then have some additional discussions here.